The scent reached me before I turned something warm and expensive, the kind of perfume that clings to fabric and memory. Then a laugh I knew too well threaded through the ballroom noise like a needle through silk. The hotel chandeliers glittered over glassware and polite applause, and when I shifted my weight, my heel tapped the base of the podium, a nervous tick I hadn't felt since college. Mark was across the room with donor's posture straight, that practiced sales smile, while a slender hand trailed over his sleeve as if it belonged there. The hand was familiar, a stack of gold bangles, a discreet scar near the thumb from a summer camp accident she'd told me about a dozen times. Tessa tilted her head the way she does when she's reading a room, and Mark leaned in to say something he didn't want heard. I swallowed something bitter and smiled for the committee like nothing had changed, even as my pulse counted out the truth I refused to name. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and whether you prefer stories with a roar of justice or the quiet kind that unfolds like a letter you read twice. If this sort of honest, family-tangled story keeps you company, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. We'll get through it together, one breath at a time. My name is Elena, and I have made a living as the person who steadies other people's teenagers when the ground under them starts to tilt. I grew up in a house where we ate at the same oak table every night, and my mother ironed napkins on Sundays because kindness, she said, lives in small habits. Mark and I met when we were 22 at a county career fair. He was all grin and ambition, pocket square folded like a promise, while I had ink on my fingers from writing notes to a shy girl who didn't want to talk to anyone. We built our life with patience, slow and decent, a 2-bedroom starter in a tree-lined neighborhood, then the modest colonial we still have, where azaleas bloom pink every May, like they're trying to impress the neighbors. It wasn't lavish, but it was ours. Thrifted furniture, with stories, a kitchen table worn smooth by homework, and birthday candles one car until we could afford 2. When Lily arrived, everything rearranged itself in the best way, the kind of love that makes you buy tiny socks you never thought about before and memorize the sound of the washing machine so you can time nap schedules. Mark traveled for work more after his promotion, and I told myself that was what good fathers do, bring home something sturdy, a future that didn't wobble. He liked to say that sales is just telling a true story with a little sparkle, and I liked to believe him because I wanted our story to shine a little too. On weekends, we volunteered at school auctions, laughing with Tessa under strings of lights while she coaxed miracles out of paper schedules and temperamental caterers. She and I traded recipes and favors and the kind of harmless gossip that makes suburban life feel busy, not empty. Tessa slid into our orbit years ago when Lily made varsity volleyball and I was handed a clipboard with too many blanks. Tessa, already known for turning bake sales into ballrooms, taught me how to make a budget look generous and a volunteer list feel like a waiting line. We partnered on everything from holiday drives to a retirement dinner for Walter, who built homes for 40 years and could still outwork men half his age. Walter calls me the steel core, says I make everything hum without ever asking for applause. And the truth is, I like the back row, the quiet table by the exit, the place where you can see everything and decide later what matters. Tessa didn't like the back row. She loved the stage light just a little the way some people love the hum of a refrigerator at night because it reminds them they're not alone. The first hairline crack came dressed as a compliment at a school fundraiser, Tessa telling Mark he wore stress beautifully, then smoothing his tie like she'd earned the right. It was so quick, I could pretend I misread it, so small I could fit it in my pocket and carry it home without mentioning it over dishwater and late-night bills. Later, there were calendar overlaps that didn't make sense. Mark and Tessa both accidentally at the print shop on the same Tuesday, a vendor calling my phone to confirm Mark's +1 for a tasting I hadn't heard about. I told myself it was proximity, the way we all swirl around each other in a small town with 1 decent florist and 2 hotels that know the difference between teal and sea glass. But subtle things became a pattern. Tessa's perfume lingering on Lily's sweatshirt after a carpool ride that wasn't hers to give Mark, coming home with a story too polished to be entirely true, and the careful way they avoided standing too close when I walked into a room. When Walter announced he wanted one last big celebration, before his knees finally convinced him to fish more than frame things. Tessa offered to plan the gala as a gift, and I felt my chest tighten even as I smiled and thanked her. I told myself, love is resilient when fed. Well, show up, build the slideshow with Lily, order the lemon tarts Walter likes, trust the man you married, and the friend who knew your coffee order. That night, under the chandeliers, I watched Mark shake hands like a promise and Tessa pivot like a star. And I decided to keep the peace, because peace felt like the only thing I could control. I tucked the doubt into the pocket of my navy dress and smoothed the fabric flat so no one would see the outline. But perfume doesn't lie, and neither does the way a man leans toward a woman when he thinks no one is watching. I finished my remarks about legacy and community, while a bead of sweat slid down my spine in a straight, accusing line. When the applause faded and the band struck up something cheerful, I stepped off the dais and caught a fragment of their whisper, my name curling like steam before vanishing in the noise. That was when I knew I would have to choose between the story I'd been telling myself and the truth that had been telling itself without me. And as the lights warmed my face, I felt the choice settling in my bones, quiet and heavy as a kept secret. The weeks after Walter's gala felt heavier than I expected. I told myself it was just exhaustion from the planning, but in the quiet of our house, I kept replaying small details that refused to fade. The scent of perfume on Mark's jacket. The quick way Tessa's bracelets slid down her arm as she touched him. The whisper that carried my name across a crowded ballroom. None of it should have mattered yet. All of it did. And the questions I pushed aside only grew sharper in the silence. Mark acted as though nothing was out of place. He came home from his trips with the same rehearsed smile, kissed my cheek, and asked what Lily needed for senior pictures. His shirts smelled of hotel soap and airport coffee, but sometimes there was a sweetness layered under it, faint but unmistakable. I folded his laundry and told myself not to notice, but even the act of smoothing collars became a quiet interrogation. When I asked how the meetings went, his answers were too polished, delivered like a salesman who had practiced them in the mirror. At school, I tried to keep my focus on the students who trusted me with their fragile fears, but I found myself distracted by the ring of my phone, wondering if Mark would call, or if Tessa's name might appear on the screen. She had a way of inserting herself into conversations warm and generous, but lately, her voice carried a note that felt almost triumphant, as though she knew a secret no one else did. When she stopped by to drop off decorations left from the gala, her perfume lingered in the hallway long after she left, and I caught Lily wrinkling her nose at the strong floral cloud that clung to the air. It was Lily who first asked, "Why is Aunt Tessa always around Dad now?" Her question landed like a stone in still water. I managed a soft smile and told her Tessa helped with events, but my throat tightened around the words. Children sense what adults try to bury, and I realized Lily had noticed the same shifts I had. I wanted to shield her from suspicion, yet I knew pretending would only make the truth heavier when it finally came. One evening after Lily had gone upstairs to study Mark, and I sat at the kitchen table with the soft hum of the dishwasher behind us. He scrolled through his phone eyes, flicking across the screen too quickly. I asked if he wanted tea, and he nodded without looking up. When I placed the mug in front of him, I saw the reflection of a message light up the glass surface of the table. The name was gone before I could be sure, but I thought I saw the curve of a T at the beginning. He tilted the phone away almost casually, then set it face down as though it were nothing at all. The following weekend, we attended a neighborhood barbecue at the Sanders home down the street. It was the kind of gathering we'd gone to for years, familiar and predictable, with potato salad and lawn chairs arranged around a fire pit. Yet this time, when Mark arrived late, Tessa came with him. They explained it away easily. He had given her a ride after they both stayed late at a meeting for the next fundraiser, but the glances that passed between them were harder to dismiss. When Mark told a story about his travels, Tessa laughed too readily, her hand brushing his arm as if she'd done it countless times before. Our neighbors watched with the kind of polite discomfort that said they noticed too, but would never dare to comment aloud. I kept my smile steady, passing plates and refilling drinks. But inside, I felt the balance of our lives slipping. It wasn't one dramatic moment. It was a string of small choices, each one eroding the trust I had built my marriage on. When I went inside to gather more cups, I caught a reflection in the sliding glass door, Mark leaning close, speaking to Tessa with an intensity he used to save for me alone. For a moment, I thought of storming out, demanding an answer in front of everyone. But instead, I steadied my breath and returned to the patio with a tray of cups. My expression calm, my voice measured. That night, when we returned home, the house felt colder. Mark showered and went to bed quickly, as though he had nothing on his conscience. I lay awake, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, wondering if it was real or performed. My mind replayed every detail, every glance, every whisper of suspicion. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in heavy, with secrets that refused to stay hidden. In the days that followed, I found myself studying the edges of our life with new eyes. The credit card bill showed charges from restaurants we had never visited together, and when I asked about them, Mark's answers were vague, brushed off as work dinners. His calendar on the fridge, once marked with Lily's games, and our family dinners grew crowded with initials and arrows that meant nothing to me. Even Walter noticed a change. One afternoon, as he helped me carry boxes from the garage, he paused and said, "Elena, is everything all right between you two? Mark seems distracted lately." I forced a smile and told him stress was heavy this season, but his eyes lingered on me as though he knew better. I tried to dismiss the doubts, but they began to bleed into everything. When Mark laughed at something on his phone, I wondered who had sent it. When he worked late, I questioned where he really was. And when Tessa appeared at Lily's game, sitting just close enough to catch his eye across the bleachers, I felt the air leave my lungs. They didn't touch, didn't speak too long, but there was an invisible thread between them, one I could see even if no one else admitted it. By the end of that week, I understood what I had been avoiding. The first cracks had opened wide enough to see through, and behind them was something I could no longer ignore. The life I thought was steady was shifting beneath me, and the people I trusted most were the ones placing the weight on the cracks. I stood at the kitchen sink one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors too beautiful for the heaviness in my chest, and I knew the story I had been telling myself was unraveling. Something was breaking, and the sound of it was only just beginning to echo. The days after the barbecue settled into a strange rhythm. On the surface, life carried on as usual. I went to work at the high school, guiding students through college applications and calming nerves before exams. Lily stayed busy with volleyball practice, her laughter and music echoing from her room. Mark moved through the house with practiced ease, his suitcase by the door, more often than not. But beneath that ordinary rhythm, I felt the cracks spreading silent and sharp, turning every small detail into a question that lodged in my chest. Nights were the hardest. I would hear his phone buzz on the nightstand, the screen lighting up in the dark, and his hand would close over it too quickly. He'd roll away from me, his shoulders curved, as if protecting something fragile. Once half asleep, I whispered, "Who's texting you so late?" His answer came too fast. "Work." The word hung in the room heavy and hollow, and I stared at the ceiling, wondering when our bedroom had become a place of secrets rather than comfort. At school, I kept my smile steady for the students who came to me with their fears, but I noticed how thin my patience had become. A girl cried about her boyfriend's silence, and while I soothed her, I felt the sting of recognition. I was supposed to be the adult with answers, yet my own heart lived in the same silence, waiting for a call that never came, or for the truth I didn't want spoken aloud. Driving home afterward, I gripped the steering wheel tightly, the lines of the road blurring as I fought back tears I didn't want to admit were mine. Tessa continued to orbit our lives as if nothing had changed. She dropped off leftover event supplies, called to ask about Lily's upcoming games, and sent group texts about community projects. But her voice on the phone carried an edge of intimacy too smooth, too sure, as though she belonged inside our marriage. One afternoon, she arrived unannounced with a box of decorations, and as she set it on the counter, I caught the faint trace of her perfume in the hallway. When Mark came home later, that same scent clung to his shirt collar. I folded it slowly in the laundry room, my hands trembling against the cotton, and realized there was no longer any space left for excuses. Even Lily noticed. She asked again why Tessa was always around Dad. Her brow furrowed in suspicion that no teenager should have to carry. I told her Tessa was just helping with projects, but my voice wavered. I saw the doubt in Lily's eyes, the way she measured my answer, and chose not to press further. Protecting her had always been my instinct, but shielding her from the truth was starting to feel like asking her to live in the same denial I was drowning in. One evening, Mark came home later than expected. His tie loosened his hair, slightly mussed. He kissed my cheek distractedly and reached for a glass of water. "Long day," I asked, my voice careful, too calm. "Meetings ran late," he said, his eyes fixed on the sink. I watched his hand slip into his pocket, pulling his phone out just far enough to check the screen before sliding it back. My chest tightened with a mix of dread and resignation. I wanted to ask the question that burned on my tongue, but I knew the answer wouldn't be the one I needed. Walter stopped by the next morning to drop off tools he had borrowed. He lingered at the door, his weathered face thoughtful. "Elena," he said gently, "something's different with Mark. He seems far away lately." I forced a smile, thanked him for noticing, and told him work had been demanding. His eyes searched mine for a moment longer before he nodded slowly, as though he didn't believe me, but chose not to push. After he left, I leaned against the closed door, my throat tight with unshed tears. Even Walter could see what I was trying to hide. That weekend, we attended Lily's volleyball match. Parents filled the bleachers, the air buzzing with cheers and squeaks of sneakers on the court. I spotted Tessa a few rows ahead, her hair perfectly styled, her bracelets catching the gym lights. She turned once, her eyes sweeping the crowd until they landed on Mark. Their gaze lingered just long enough for my stomach to twist. Mark clapped when Lily scored, his expression proud. But his glance toward Tessa betrayed something else. I sat frozen, my hands clenched together, the noise of the gym fading under the weight of that silent exchange. Later that night, when the house was quiet, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chairs around me. I thought of the life we had built, the long days, the shared sacrifices, the small joys tucked into ordinary routines. And then I thought of the way he leaned toward her, the way her laughter wrapped around him like a ribbon. My eyes blurred, and for the first time, I allowed myself to cry openly, my head bowed against folded arms. The tears came hot and unrelenting, spilling years of trust and love onto the wood grain of the table. I told no one about those tears. By morning, I had washed my face and prepared breakfast, slipping back into the motions of normalcy. But inside, something had shifted. The doubts were no longer whispers. They were a constant drumbeat echoing through every room of the house. I began to understand that silence would not protect me, and pretending would not save what was already slipping away. When I passed by the hall mirror that evening, I barely recognized the woman reflected there. Her eyes were tired, her shoulders heavy with secrets she didn't ask to carry. I touched the glass lightly, as if steadying her, and whispered, "Not much longer." It wasn't a promise yet, but it was the first breath of one fragile and uncertain. And as I turned off the kitchen light and climbed the stairs, I knew the quiet suffering could not last forever. Something was waiting to surface, and when it did, there would be no turning back. The night I whispered to the reflection in the mirror, something inside me settled into a clarity I could no longer ignore. The tears had run their course, and what remained was a steadiness that surprised me. I began to notice everything with sharper eyes, no longer softening the edges of what I saw. Every glance, every shift in tone, every unexplained absence carried a meaning I could not dismiss. One evening after school, I stopped by the grocery store to pick up a few things for dinner. As I reached for a bag of apples, I noticed a couple 2 aisles over. The woman's laugh was bright, caring above the shelves, and when I turned, I saw Tessa's profile as clear as day. Mark stood beside her, his hand resting on the cart she pushed. They weren't pressed close, but there was a comfort between them that didn't belong in casual errands. My chest tightened, and for a moment I froze, holding the apples like they might shatter in my hands. I didn't approach them. Instead, I left the cart behind and walked out with nothing. The cool evening air slapping against my face, as if to wake me from a dream I'd kept alive too long. That night, I cooked dinner quietly while Mark chatted about sales numbers, his voice smooth and practiced. He asked about Lily's week, smiling as if he hadn't just strolled the produce aisle with another woman. I answered evenly, setting the food on the table, my heart hammering under the calm surface I wore like armor. When Lily excused herself after eating, I cleared the plates and asked him, "Were you at the store today?" He blinked his fork, pausing midair. "Yeah, quick stop after work." "Why?" My eyes searched his face, but I only said nothing. "Just curious." His gaze flickered away, and in that silence I knew my question had struck the place where truth hid. I began to watch more closely. His trips for meetings seemed to align with Tessa's sudden unavailability for school projects. When I called her once to ask about auction donations, she answered breathless, saying she was out of town with family. Later that evening, Mark's tie was missing from the closet, and I found it tucked in his suitcase under travel brochures for the same city she had named. I sat on the edge of the bed, the fabric soft in my hands, and I realized the stories were no longer adding up. Walter stopped by that weekend to see Lily. As we sat on the porch with coffee, his voice lowered. "Elena, I know Mark is my son, but something isn't right. I see how you carry yourself, and I know what worry looks like." His words were kind, but they stung with the truth I was trying not to say aloud. I assured him I was managing, though. My smile faltered. He nodded, eyes heavy, as though he wanted to say more, but decided against it. Watching him drive away, I thought about the man who had built homes with his hands, who had seen strength as something you lay brick by brick. I wondered if he knew his son was tearing down what I had worked to hold together. The turning point came on a Friday evening. Lily had gone to a friend's for a study night, and I decided to tidy the living room. As I gathered magazines from the coffee table, a slip of paper fell from the pages, an event invitation with Tessa's name scrawled in the margin. The date matched the weekend Mark claimed he was swamped with back-to-back client dinners. My hands trembled as I held it, the ink-clear evidence of their shared world. I tucked it back between the pages, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I needed time to decide what to do next. That night, Mark came home later than ever, his shirt untucked, his cologne sharper than usual. He kissed my cheek as if nothing had changed, but the moment lingered sour on my skin. I went to bed before him, lying still as he moved around the room. I heard the faint buzz of his phone, the whispered click of a message sent in secret, and I understood then that the truth was not waiting to reveal itself. It was already in the room, breathing beside me. The next morning, I rose early and brewed coffee, sitting in the quiet kitchen, with the first light spilling through the window. I thought of all the years I had spent building a home, smoothing every rough patch with patience, filling the silence with hope. And I realized I could no longer live in denial, no longer pretend that suspicion was just imagination. The truth had already arrived, and the only choice left was whether I would face it openly or let it keep eroding the life I had worked to protect. As the coffee cooled in my cup, I felt a calm resolve settle in my chest. The days of turning away from whispers and perfume trails were over. The next step would not be about hiding or softening. It would be about opening my eyes completely, no matter how much it hurt. And as I stood to pour the last of the coffee down the sink, I knew the time had come to prepare for what lay ahead. The silence was finished. What waited now was truth sharp and undeniable, and I could feel it pressing at the edges of our life, ready to break through. The decision came quietly, without anger, almost like slipping on a coat I had owned for years but rarely wore. I could not stop Mark from lying, and I could not prevent Tessa from inserting herself into our life. What I could do was choose how I carried myself, and that was where my strength began. I stopped waiting for explanations. Instead, I began gathering what I needed, facts, patterns, and proof that would speak louder than the excuses I had grown used to hearing. It started small. I opened a notebook and wrote down the dates of his so-called work trips, comparing them with the community events Tessa suddenly stopped attending. The overlap was undeniable. Each line of ink steadied me, replacing helplessness with clarity. I checked bank statements and found dinners charged at restaurants 2 towns over nights, when he had sworn he was buried in conference calls. I printed copies and slid them into a folder, the paper cool against my fingers, proof of what I already knew, but refused to leave floating in my head. I didn't rush. I went about my days as though nothing had shifted. At school, I smiled at the students and listened carefully to their worries. At home, I cooked dinners, paid bills, and folded laundry while Mark moved through the rooms like a shadow. But under the surface, every action of mine carried intent. When he left his phone unattended, I didn't snoop. I didn't need to. His care to hide things was evidence enough. Instead, I slipped into the habit of photographing receipts left in his jacket pockets, storing them in the same folder. One evening, Lily asked if she could use the family laptop for a project. After she logged in, she handed me a flash drive she had found left in the bag we all used for shared files. "I think this is Dad's," she said casually, not realizing the weight of what she handed over. Later, after she went upstairs, I slid the drive into my own computer. It held nothing scandalous, only travel itineraries and reservation confirmations. But one detail stood out: a hotel booking for 2 under his company discount. I stared at the screen, my heart steady now rather than racing. Proof had a way of numbing pain. I reached out to someone I trusted outside the family. James Reed, a lawyer I'd met years earlier through the school's scholarship board, was discreet and thoughtful. I scheduled coffee under the pretense of discussing a student's application, and only once we were seated in a quiet corner did I explain. His expression didn't change much, but his voice was firm. "Keep documenting. Don't confront yet. Preparation is your ally." His words landed like anchor stones, heavy but grounding. I nodded, sliding the folder across for him to glance through before taking it back. When I left the cafe, the air felt crisper, as if I had taken the first true step out of denial. At home, I began practicing silence in a new way. When Mark said he was late because of traffic, I simply nodded, writing down the time he walked through the door. When he mentioned a dinner with colleagues, I smiled faintly later, confirming the charge on our account. It wasn't coldness, it was restraint. and it gave me back a measure of control I hadn't felt in months. Meanwhile, I noticed Lily watching me more closely. She didn't voice her suspicions again, but her eyes carried quiet questions. I tried to shield her from the heaviness keeping our evenings light when it was just the two of us. We cooked together, her laughter bright in the kitchen, as she teased me about chopping onions too slowly. I cherished those moments, reminding myself that everything I was preparing was for her as much as for myself. The first sign that Mark sensed the shift came during dinner one Thursday. He set down his fork and studied me. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I met his eyes calm. "I've just had a lot on my mind at school." He nodded, searching for more, but I gave him nothing. His unease was almost visible, a flicker in the way he shifted in his chair. That silence between us grew heavier than any argument might have. Tessa called one evening while he was in the shower. I saw her name light up on the screen where he had left his phone on the dresser. I didn't touch it. I only watched the screen buzz her name glowing in the dim light of the bedroom and then fade away. That restraint gave me more power than answering ever could. Later, when he picked it up, he didn't notice my eyes on him as he typed quickly, his back turned. Over the next weeks, I quietly organized the pieces of my life. I opened a separate account in my own name, transferring small amounts that wouldn't draw attention. I reviewed the house deed Walter had signed over to Mark years earlier, noting my name's absence. It stung, but it also clarified what I needed to prepare for. I reached out again to James, who assured me that documentation and patience were my strongest tools. "It isn't about rushing into battle," he reminded me. "It's about letting the truth weigh itself down until it can't be denied." One evening, I placed all the evidence, the receipts, itineraries, notes, and photographs, into a single envelope. I tucked it in a locked drawer in my desk, knowing I would not use it yet but needing it close. It wasn't revenge I was after, not in the way people imagine shouting in a public scene. It was dignity. It was making sure that when the time came, I would not tremble with doubt or lack the proof of my own eyes. I lay awake that night, listening to the steady rhythm of the clock, and I realized something had shifted inside me. The tears and confusion that had filled the last months were fading, replaced by a steadier current. I wasn't waiting for the truth to crush me anymore. I was preparing to meet it head-on. And as I finally drifted to sleep, I understood that my silence was no longer a cage. It had become a shield, and behind it, I was learning how to stand. The next step would not be hidden in notebooks or receipts. It would require stepping into the light, and I could feel that moment drawing near. The envelope in my desk drawer was no longer just paper and ink. It was weight. Every evening I passed by that drawer, the knowledge inside it hummed louder, urging me forward. I had proof now, not just suspicions or half-glimpsed moments, but undeniable patterns that tied Mark and Tessa together. The question that pressed against me was when and how to let the truth show itself. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. Walter called one evening, his voice warm but edged with fatigue. He wanted the family to gather for Sunday dinner, a tradition he missed since the gala. He said he needed to see us all in one room, as though he sensed storms moving closer. I agreed, even while my stomach tightened, because I realized it was the very stage I needed. That Sunday, the house smelled of roast chicken and rosemary the way Walter liked it. Lily helped me set the table, her hands steady, though I noticed her eyes drift toward the empty chair beside mine. She had stopped asking questions, but silence speaks its own language. Mark arrived late, carrying flowers for me, as if petals could hide his absence. Tessa came not long after with a bottle of wine and a smile practiced enough to belong to a hostess, not a guest. Walter sat at the head of the table, his hands folded over one another, watching each of us as though measuring more than the meal. Dinner began with polite conversation, updates about Lily's classes, Walter's stories about old projects, Tessa's chatter about upcoming events. I listened quietly, the envelope resting upstairs in the locked drawer, its presence steady in my mind. Mark reached for the wine, pouring for Tessa before he filled my glass, and something about that small reversal struck me as louder than words. Walter noticed his brow tightening, though he said nothing. As the meal moved on, the undercurrent between them grew harder to ignore. Their glances stretched just a moment too long, their laughter overlapped, as if rehearsed. I let the silence build, choosing not to interrupt, until Walter finally set down his fork with a sharp clink. "Family should be built on honesty," he said, his voice low but firm. "And I can't sit at this table pretending I don't see what's right in front of me." The room stilled. Mark's hand froze mid-gesture, and Tessa's smile faltered. Lily glanced between us, her fork hovering eyes wide. I steadied my breath, the calm I had cultivated over weeks wrapping around me like a shield. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply asked, "Would either of you like to explain why your names appear together on hotel reservations?" The silence was sharp, broken only by the creak of Walter's chair as he leaned forward. Mark's face drained of color, and he stammered, "That's not what you think." Tessa tried to speak over him, her tone too bright, too brittle. "It was just logistics, Elena. Easier to book together for." I cut her off, my voice even. "For work dinners, 2 towns over. For the weekends, you both vanished with excuses that never matched." Lily dropped her fork, the sound echoing in the charged room. Walter's hand tightened around his glass, but his voice was steady. "I raised my son to know better than this." Mark shifted in his seat, torn between anger and shame, but I didn't waver. The evidence was no longer hidden in drawers. It was spilling across the table in every unspoken word, every guilty glance. I didn't shout, and I didn't weep. Instead, I let the silence weigh on them until even their excuses sounded hollow. I gave you both the benefit of trust. I said, my tone quiet, and you both chose to treat it as a stage for lies. Tessa opened her mouth, then closed it again, her bracelets clinking as her hands trembled. Mark pushed back his chair as though he could walk away from the weight of what was unfolding. But Walter's voice stopped him cold. "Sit down. If you're man enough to make choices, you're man enough to face them." The rest of the meal was left untouched. Lily excused herself, her eyes shining with betrayal, though she said nothing. Tessa muttered something about needing to leave, but Walter's glare held her in place. Mark tried again to explain, his words tumbling over each other, but I only shook my head. "You asked for silence," I said softly. "But silence doesn't erase truth. It only delays it." When the table finally broke apart, it wasn't with slammed doors or shouting matches. It was with the slow collapse of facades. Tessa slipped out quickly, avoiding everyone's eyes. Mark stayed seated, staring at the untouched plate before him, shoulders heavy with the weight of his unraveling mask. Walter lingered in the doorway, his voice softer now. "Elena, whatever you decide, you don't face it alone." That night, after everyone had gone, I sat in the stillness of the dining room, the smell of rosemary fading into the walls. The plates were half cleared, the glasses smeared with fingerprints, a silent record of the evening. I gathered the silverware slowly, one piece at a time, knowing something irreversible had begun. The truth was no longer mine to carry in secret. It had been placed in the open where it could not be buried again. And as I stacked the dishes by the sink, I felt a shift inside me. The time for quiet preparation was ending. What came next would not be private suspicions or hidden notes. It would be the breaking point where everything they had built on lies would begin to fall. The night of Walter's dinner had left the walls of our home heavier than I had ever known them. Mark moved quietly from room to room. His footsteps measured his voice, stripped of its usual certainty. The facade had cracked not just in front of me, but in front of his father and his daughter. He tried to smooth it over in small ways, flowers left on the counter, offers to help with dishes, gestures that once might have mattered. Now they felt like paint brushed over rotting wood. Walter called the next day, his tone steady. "Elena, you stood your ground with grace," he said. "Don't doubt yourself now." His words carried weight not just as a father-in-law, but as a man who had built his life on solid foundations. He didn't stay long on the phone, but his support lingered long after the call ended. For the first time in months, I felt less alone in carrying the truth. The unraveling began quickly after that. Tessa stopped attending the school meetings she once dominated. Her name disappeared from volunteer lists, and when I passed her at the grocery store, she turned sharply down another aisle, bracelets jangling as she hurried away. The bright laughter that had filled every corner of our gatherings was suddenly absent, replaced by whispers and narrowed eyes from neighbors who had been at Walter's dinner. The silence around her was its own kind of verdict. Mark fared no better. At work, his hours grew longer, but not for the reasons he claimed. A colleague, Brian Coleman, who had once invested in one of Mark's projects, called me quietly one evening. "I thought you should know," he said, his voice low. "Mark's reputation is slipping. Clients are asking questions about his judgment." I thanked him, my hand tightening around the receiver. The world that Mark had worked so carefully to polish was crumbling under its own contradictions. At home, Lily's distance was sharpest of all. She answered his questions with short phrases, avoided lingering in the same room, and excused herself quickly after meals. One evening, as he tried to comment on her upcoming match, she stood from the table, her voice clipped. "Don't pretend now, Dad, we all know." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him staring at his plate, pale and silent. I kept my focus steady. The envelope of proof no longer felt like my only shield. The truth had already spread beyond our walls. I didn't need to shout or accuse. All I had to do was remain calm while his world buckled. I continued documenting quietly, not because I still needed to convince myself, but because I knew the end was near. The breaking point came during a school fundraiser held at the community center. It was an event Tessa had once claimed as her own, the kind she used to orchestrate with flair. This time, I had taken her place on the committee. As I walked into the room, dressed simply in navy with a silver necklace Lily had given me years ago, conversations stilled for just a moment. People greeted me warmly, their eyes kind, and I felt a strength in that quiet recognition. Mark arrived late, his suit slightly wrinkled, his smile brittle. He moved through the crowd, trying to reclaim the role he had once played so easily, shaking hands and making jokes. But whispers followed him, and I saw the way people exchanged glances after he passed. He looked smaller somehow, the light he once commanded now dimming under scrutiny. Halfway through the evening, he approached me near the refreshment table. "Elena, can we talk?" he asked, his voice urgent. I held my glass steady, meeting his eyes. "We've already talked," I said softly. "Now the truth speaks for itself." He flinched, his jaw tightening, but before he could respond, Walter joined us. His presence was quiet, but commanding. "Sonny said sometimes the hardest lesson is that respect once lost isn't easily found again." Mark turned away, retreating into the crowd, but the murmurs followed him. Later, as I helped gather leftover programs and plates, I overheard two parents whispering near the doorway. "I used to admire him," one said. "But now, it's clear who really carried the family." I walked past them without a word, but inside, I felt the truth settle firmly into place. By the end of the week, Tessa announced she was stepping back from community projects. Mark's firm reassigned him to smaller accounts, citing concerns about professionalism. At home, the silence stretched longer each night. He tried to bridge it with small gestures, but they landed flat. The man who had once held every thread of control now found them slipping through his fingers. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, Lily joined me. She leaned against my shoulder, her voice quiet. "Mom, I'm proud of you. You didn't yell. You didn't break. You just showed them." Her words filled the night air with something softer than victory, something closer to peace. I placed my hand over hers, the warmth of her trust grounding me more than anything else could. Inside, I could hear Mark pacing in the living room, restless, searching for words that no longer had power. The man who had once demanded silence from me was now surrounded by it, and in that silence, his world was collapsing piece by piece. And as the days passed, I understood that justice was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was the steady exposure of truth, the quiet dignity of refusing to bend. Mark's downfall wasn't mine to orchestrate, it was his to endure, and he was enduring it now. The only step left was deciding what my future would look like once the dust settled. That choice waited just ahead, steady and certain, like the dawn rising after a long night. When the dust of Mark's unraveling finally settled, our house felt different. The tension that had once clung to the walls eased away, leaving a quieter kind of air. He no longer carried himself with the certainty of a man in control. Instead, he moved like someone learning that consequences cannot be outpaced, no matter how hard you run from them. Walter kept his word and stood beside me. He stopped by more often sometimes, just to share coffee at the kitchen table, other times to bring Lily a stack of old photo albums she loved flipping through. He didn't try to excuse Mark, and in that silence, he gave me more comfort than words ever could. Lily, too, seemed lighter. She still hurt, of course, but she no longer carried the weight of pretending she didn't see what was happening. Her focus returned to her schoolwork, her laughter coming easier as the months passed. Tessa faded into the background of our town like a shadow after sunset. She withdrew from the community events that once revolved around her, her absence leaving only quiet speculation. I didn't need to hear every detail to know that her reputation had taken the blow she once thought she could outrun. For years, she had stepped into rooms with confidence. Now she walked quickly, head lowered, avoiding the very eyes that used to admire her. As for Mark, the collapse of his image was slow but relentless. Clients grew wary, neighbors distanced themselves, and even casual acquaintances began to see the truth that could no longer be hidden. His attempts to smooth it over rang hollow. It wasn't my doing, it was his own choices catching up to him. I had not screamed nor tried to destroy him. I had simply stopped protecting him from himself, and that was enough. In the quiet of our home, I began rebuilding. I painted the living room walls a pale shade of green, the kind that reminded me of spring leaves. I planted herbs along the kitchen window, filling the air with the gentle scent of rosemary and basil. Lily helped me move furniture, turning the space into something that felt truly ours. Each small change reminded me that healing doesn't always come in grand gestures, it often begins with steady, ordinary steps. I also found comfort in the support of friends I hadn't leaned on in years. Pamela, a college friend, reached out after hearing whispers of what had happened. We met for coffee, and her laughter filled a part of me I hadn't realized was starved. It reminded me that life doesn't end with betrayal. Sometimes it simply takes a different shape, one that leaves more room for peace than for chaos. Through it all, I learned something I wish I had understood earlier. Love without respect is only possession in disguise. Mark wanted loyalty without offering it in return, and Tessa wanted admiration without the responsibility of honesty. When their illusions fell apart, they were left with nothing but the truth of who they had always been. For me, dignity came not from revenge, but from restraint. I didn't need to expose every detail or scream every accusation. The truth had its own way of revealing itself. By holding steady, I let their actions speak louder than anything I could have said. And in that choice, I discovered a freedom far greater than I expected, the freedom of living without fear, without excuses, and without the weight of someone else's lies pressing against my heart. Today, I move forward with a quieter strength. Walter's presence remains steady in our lives. Lily is preparing for college with bright hope, and our home feels once again like a place of safety. Mark and I are no longer partners in the ways that matter, and though that reality carries sadness, it also carries clarity. Some endings are not failures, they are simply the moment you finally stop carrying what was never truly yours to bear. As I sit with this chapter closed, I think often of the women who carry silent burdens in their homes, unsure when or if they'll ever set them down. To them, I would say, this silence does not have to mean surrender. Sometimes it can be your strongest weapon, your way of reclaiming space, until the truth has no choice but to show itself. And so my story is not one of dramatic revenge, but of quiet justice and restored dignity. Betrayal tried to take my voice, but I found it again in patience, in truth, and in the steady rhythm of my own resilience. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.